Welcome to the Meher Baba program. I'm your host, Fred Stankus, and this is the Meher Baba program titled In Company with the Avatar. And that company, of course, is our company, Don Stevens, visiting from Europe. Don met Meher Baba several times in his life and is going to describe some of those experiences. Some background information on Don is that he was born in Nevada near Reno, lived in Madera, California, and then from there went on to college on the East Coast, went to Johns Hopkins and graduated, and of course from there went on to work for a major oil company. And he spent over 30 years with that company and went through quite a dilemma when he was in that business in regards to his future in that kind of a corporate world, or perhaps in choosing more of a spiritual path to seek. So, Don, can you bring us up on that dilemma that was part of your experience with Meher Baba?
It certainly was, Fred, and one of the most important parts of my experience with Baba. I think it was not too long after the great meeting in India that Meher Baba entitled in 1962 the East-West Gathering. He had told us for a long time that he wanted to bring some of his principal lovers from the East and the West together and to meld them together, I suppose, as a pilot project for the future, for the world, for civilization. But after that particular visit, I had the opportunity, after 62, on numerous occasions, to visit Baba very, very informally and rather spontaneously many times. So after this enormous gathering, which was most impressive and really very fulfilling from a human standpoint and a spiritual standpoint, I would go back to where Baba was living, some 15 miles outside of Ahmednagar, not terribly far from Pune, and I'd be around Baba and the very close ones called the Mandali, sometimes for days at a time, sometimes with no other visitors coming in. He would be in seclusion or even semi-seclusion, and I'd be involved in their very, very simple life. Well, tell you the truth, Fred, at that time I began to get more and more uncomfortable inside of myself, because by that time I'd gotten to a fairly responsible position in this oil company, and because the type of work that I did involved making enormously expensive, important sales to outside independent customers, of course I had to entertain them very well. And I was always expected, wherever I was, to stay in the top hotel in whatever city or village I happened to be for the moment. I remember in our company, this enormous complex company, the president of the entire company once complained to my immediate boss that I had a larger standing monthly allowance than he had himself. Can you imagine? So, as you might say, I was really leading the life of Riley. So here I would be doing the Riley Act one day, and 24 hours later I'd be sitting cross-legged in a Mandali Hall or on the compound or something of the sort, in the most simple environment where Baba and the Mandali were living very, very not barren lives, not deprived lives, but the most simple sort of living that you can imagine. Well, trying to reconcile these two opposites inside of myself just finally got to be too much for me. So I decided I was going to have to jettison the oil industry. There was no other way about it. I was going to have to go back to school, re-equip myself for something closer to human problems, maybe become a psychoanalyst. We had always had very close connections to Carl Jung, and I admired enormously what I saw people trained by him were doing. So that was one possibility. The other was to go back to school and study sociology, go into a city government somewhere, and try to work on these abysmal human problems that we have in the heart of every city in the world. So, with my mind made up, I said to myself, next time that I get to India, I'm going to take this up. I'm going to tell Baba, finished with the oil industry, back to the university, and here are the two choices that I've decided. I thought this all out myself because I thought it was my duty to get this all organized and carefully thought out and present it to Meher Baba. I arrive, sit down in Mandali Hall, and Baba asked me the usual questions. Did you sleep well? Did you digest well? Did you go to the potty, and is that all done well? And all these things that he always asked about your daily life. And we got all through that. And then I said, Baba, I really got to talk something serious. So I explained to him what had gone on in my mind, and Baba's doing this, he wasn't speaking, but he could gesture, and the way he moved his eyes, you were just invited to pour your heart out. So I got one or two sentences through, and suddenly I noticed that Baba's attention seemed to be wavering, and he was looking over towards Arish, his chief male disciple, Mandali, who was sitting next to him and deciphering his gestures, and he started wiggling his fingers over to Arish. And so at that point I thought to myself, well, something's going wrong here. This isn't quite the attention that I expected for this earth-shaking decision that I'd taken. So I waited until this little conversation between Arish and Baba was done. Baba looks back at me and, come on, let's get rolling, Don. What is? Now explain to me. So I did a couple more sentences, and suddenly I see that Baba isn't looking at me anymore. He's back wiggling his fingers at Arish. And this sort of made me mad, to tell you the truth. And so I said, if that's all the interest that I'm going to get out of it, I'm going to shut up. But I thought I would certainly have another chance because I was going to be there for 3 or 4 days. But I got on the plane back in Bombay, and I suddenly thought, my God, I forgot to bring up this important subject again. And then I got mad at myself because I was convinced that my subconscious really didn't want to give up this plush life in the petroleum industry, and that my heart really wasn't in this business of helping humankind, and that I'd better have a little heart-to-heart conversation with myself. So I fought this out, and it was only about a month later that I was back visiting Baba, and I said, now this time I really got to get this through. Well, exactly the same scenario. Baba says, how's everything going? And then I say, I want to get really into this business that we started talking about last time. Oh, yes, last time we didn't quite finish that. And Baba's all attention again, Exactly the same thing happens again. 2, 3 sentences, I'm explaining, I've got to get out of the oil industry and get closer to humankind's problems, and Baba starts doing another conversation with Arish, and then looks back at me, and he doesn't even look terribly interested the second time, though. And so I said to myself, well, I'll wait till a little bit later. And again, finally, I left the second time without bringing the question up. And so it was about 6 months before I got back the third time, and I knew this time I was going to have to beat it through some way, swallow my pride, beat on a gong if necessary to get Baba's attention and get this thing moving. So I said, Baba, twice we've tried to discuss this problem about my leaving the petroleum industry. Baba looks at me and he nods his head, but this time he doesn't smile at me, Fred. He said to me almost immediately, and Don, who do you think put you in the petroleum industry? Well, that really, it completely startled me. That was the last reply that I'd ever thought of. And the very first thing that went through my mind, just like the stories go, that when you die, you review all of your lives in 1 or 2 seconds afterwards. So I reviewed all of this kaleidoscopic series of interviews and conversations and applications that I'd gone through for about 6 months, and finally, I thought deciding on this particular fine, splendid petroleum company that finally accepted me. But as soon as I saw that Bob had asked me that, I suddenly thought to myself, no, I've had it all wrong. Something that important in my life and somebody as important as Mayor Baba, there is absolutely no way that he couldn't have been involved in it, even though I didn't even know his name at the time I was making the application. I just knew it had to have functioned that way. And the second thing that I knew was terribly, terribly important is, for the first time I realized that your spiritual life is not just excluded from your business professional life and are only concentrated on certain perhaps important human relations. I don't know. I'd always thought, as so many people do, that industry and money and keeping books and finances is anti-spiritual, not just not spiritual, but anti-spiritual. And suddenly to realize that it would have to be a crazy, crazy universe that we live in if God's Son on earth allowed 8 to 10 hours a day to pass by with no spiritual progress at all. You know, it'd be a cockeyed world that we lived in. And I suddenly realized he has to use our professional lives as well, regardless what they are. So this all broke over me. And so Baba said, yes, Don, I put you there because this happens to be the particular area of modern enterprise which is most suited to unraveling the particular habit patterns and compulsions and emotional hang-ups that you have, which are on, as it were, the griddle. He didn't use the word griddle, but which are on the stove cooking for this particular lifetime. And as soon as he said that, I realized, well, that's terribly important, and I've looked at this exactly the wrong way. And then he pointed his finger at me, and he says, and now you stick with it. So I did.
Well, that also brings you to, in company with the avatar, also in these fine these publications. God Speaks, Listen to Humanity, and the discourses. And Baba orchestrated you to work with him, his works that you helped publish and edit.
Yes.
And also 4 books of that you have authored yourself, all through his inspiration. So he had plans for you, didn't he? Not just with the oil business.
Well, as I said in a previous story, you know, my first meeting of Baba, to know that he knew me better than myself, I kept finding that out. He knew what I needed, but he also knew my potential resources that I would have absolutely no idea about. That came up again and again and again. Maybe we'll have time for an amusing story about the French language, but at any rate, certainly Baba knew what everybody around him, what their potential resources were, and what were the necessary steps to bring those resources into fruition and to use in the practical world. And he pushed us towards it.
You know, another thing I've read about your background was your work and importance you placed on group-like teaching and group support in regards to spiritual matters. Can you give us a little bit of a explanation of some of those experiences?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess maybe I have to bring out a little of my own dirty linen on that. I just have to tell you quite frankly, Fred, that from the early days of my life, I had a positive allergy to groups and to group activity. I've always been a rather individualistic person, and to commit myself to a group and to commit to any sort of a group enterprise or group discipline was totally, absolutely, totally distasteful to me. And actually, it wasn't until the death of Mercia de Martin, before we all, including herself, had actually met Mayor Baba for the first time in the flesh, it was at her death that for the first time I was the only person on the West Coast, apparently, who had gone through certain particular training with her. And so, although I was the youngest person around at that point, I inherited the responsibility for the small nucleus in the Bay Area. And so, you know, when something happens and you've got to do something, you get on with it, you do it. And despite all of my antipathy for group activity, I went ahead and I met with this little group, and perfectly obviously, I fell in love with them almost immediately. I had met them socially, but Marcia de Martin had never had me in any group activity with them. She had always handled me personally. I was the only person that she would sit on the chair, on the rug just in front of her, and teach certain things about Sufism. She knew my prejudices, but there at her death, I inherited that responsibility, and for the first time, I was in a group, and I began to see certain things that happened in a group functioning. But then, to make a long story short, one of the first things that I obviously thought, like everybody thought, that if you're successful, the group gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and finally you have to put in spare chairs and back, and then you hire a larger hall. This is our usual definition of success. And I thought this spiritual success ought to work this way. But that first little group in the Bay Area, we sat together. We were 5 people, and we were together, never with another person in our group, for I think it was about 5 years. And I've always felt that that for me was the pilot plant project to show me what real spiritual search between kindred honest souls was. And that was a terribly, terribly important lesson. Then, eventually, I was transferred over to Europe. I found exactly the same sort of ferment happening in England with the young people, letting their hair grow long, wearing blue jeans that were all holy, and I don't think had been washed in 6 years, or maybe 10 years, I don't know. But at any rate, they were pretty horrible to behold, long, scraggly beards, but asking pertinent questions, and terribly important questions. So you forget all about these external accoutrements, and you plunge into the things that are really important that are going on inside of them. And the strange thing, in all of these constantly was that the group that would finally coalesce would be somewhere between, say, 4 and I think about a maximum of 12 persons. It just kept happening that way. And then on a few occasions, a group would form that was larger, and I would find that there was a strange inability for the people within the group to communicate with each other. I rather rapidly began to find that really people know the truth inside of themselves, and all you've got to do is provide a little bit of time, and maybe even a little bit of prodding for them to say things that are absolutely extraordinary. So you put a group together, and first thing you know, they're coming up with spiritual truths, and if they're focusing on Meher Baba, for instance, they come up with absolutely incredible insights into what he is doing and what he is trying to show us in our own personal lives. So I rather rapidly began to suspect not only that groups are important, that they do something that has real value, but also that it's not the large group in which the really vital, important things are happening inside of one. It's a much smaller one where people begin to feel a certain sense of security, of faith, trust, affection. Meher Baba calls it inner links, and he emphasizes the importance of the establishment of inner links. I have seen groups be enormously successful and go on exchanging these things and progressing and finding new things inside of themselves for 15, 20 years. And I've seen other groups which started functioning the same fashion, and then some sort of a block, usually between 2 people here and 2 people over here would form. And there's a block in communication. And that would affect the whole group, and I would find that the group never could properly communicate within itself and share experience and move along. And so there's no choice. You just have to disband the group. But I really suspect that what we are going into now is a new age of the manner in which the people who've got to find truth, the mechanics in which they go about it. And I suspect what I fell into may be an indication of the mechanics for the future. I didn't find it myself, Fred. I didn't manufacture it myself, but it's happened so many times now, and I have seen over 30, 40 years, more or less, when it functions extraordinarily well, and when it gets blocked, to feel that I suspect what the Christ avatar figure intends for the next age of the search for truth is going to have rather radically different mechanics. And I think this rather small, intimate, very cohesive, very trusting circle, as I call it, is very important in that mechanics.
And to that end, in these groups, has the subject of occult experiences been brought up, which seems to be somewhat of interest to young people of today?
Well, I'm afraid it certainly does come up. Especially at the present time, France, which has always been considered the paragon of logic and intellect, many, a large majority even of the people searching for truth, when you get right down to it, they're looking for occult phenomena. Some way or another, they associate this with spirituality and spiritual progress. But I'll always remember back to one thing that MeherBaba says in one of his discourses, and it's borne out to me more and more as being fundamental and important. And this simply is, he says that a great master rarely utilizes occult events in the lives of the aspirant. In other words, okay, a great master has certain aspirants around him, but MeherBaba says that really a great master almost never uses the great occult happening in the person's life in order to teach him something. He says when they're about to face a great crisis or when they need a renewal of conviction or energy, then on a rare occasion, the real master may use it to reinforce them. And then Baba goes on and says something very interesting, and I think this is a heart of a very practical question. He says, immediately, though, the real master must put into effect countermeasures to curb the wish of that individual for repetitions and repetitions and repetitions of this extraordinary, impossible event. He simply says, yes, it has reinforced them, but it has also whetted their appetite for this, because they're heady, they're intoxicating. The individual says, gee, I'm right in the middle of a great spiritual event, It hits them over the head, and they want more of it. But Baba says this isn't spirituality. There is no spiritual truth at all involved in an occult event. It simply says to the individual, creation is a lot more complex than we ever dreamed that it was, but within the occult event itself, aside from a reinforcement perhaps of conviction that one is on a proper track, that's the end of the story. But I've seen people spend a whole lifetime fixated right there, trying to learn how to control these things, these occult forces. They're there. But an occult force is not God realization or illumination or anywhere near it. So why sit around 1/3 or a quarter of the way on the path and be stuck for an entire lifetime because of an intoxication of an exciting event?
Yes. And going now back to In Company with the Avatar, in 1956, MeherBaba made a tour of the United States, and one of his stops was nearby in Ojai, California, about 80 miles from here. Mm-hmm. And can you reflect on a little bit of that particular stop? Do you recall something of Baba's visit to Ojai and Meher Mount?
It's odd, Fred. We've talked about Ojai 2, 3, 4 times since we've seen each other, and just suddenly I remember an event that occurred right out in the garden in Ojai, which to me was one of the most revealing things I ever experienced with Baba. He was surrounded by people who had come out from the East Coast on the plane with him, and there were a number of Westerners there also. And after, I can't remember how it all started, but in the late afternoon when we were all relaxed, suddenly a very, very charming blonde girl from New York, who had gone to all of the best schools and had just been married for, maybe a year. And she came up to Baba, and there were only 2 or 3 others who knew her very well around. She chose that instant to ask Baba something very important to her heart. And she said, Baba, we've not been able to have any children, and I do want children. Baba, can't I have 1 or 2 children? And Baba looked at her almost thunderstruck. And he said, yes, as the Avatar, I can grant this wish. But he said, normally, almost never, one almost never asks me for this sort of thing, or for riches, or to solve a problem or something of the sort. Inner progress, yes. Progress towards realization of the truth and the reality of God, yes. But because you love me so much, so totally, I will grant your wish, yes. You were not scheduled in this lifetime. Your karma is not to have children, but because of your love for me and your surrenderance, I will grant you this wish. But he said, I also point out to you, you cannot imagine the millions and millions and millions of adjustments that I have to make in the lives of other persons in order to accommodate your wish. It was an extraordinary experience.
And that was on Meher Mount.
That was on Meher Mount. And she had, I think, 2 children, as I recall.
Was there any other experiences coupled with that visit that you recall, or the environment at Meher Mount? Did Meher Baba comment anything to you or to others about his visit to Meher Mount?
I think it was also at Meher Mount in part of his discussion of a few principles that Baba said, your karma, you have evolved your karma. It has been with you since your origin as a drop soul. I can change your karma. I can eliminate karmic problems. But he said, why should I do things for which I ultimately am responsible for the laws? He said, because of your love for you, I will take, on occasion, your karma from your head and lower it to your shoulders. But I will not eliminate it nor cancel it.
Wonderful.
Another extraordinary statement, but it should be that way.
Yes. It looks like our time is about up again, Don. Well, I really thank you so much for coming on the MeherBaba
Great
program
pleasure.
and sharing with us, our viewers, this valuable information about your experiences with the avatar of the age, MeherBaba. Thank you.
In daily life, that's the important thing.
In daily. So until the next MeherBaba program, remember, don't worry, be happy. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.